Have you ever noticed in your Bible some of the strangest events can teach us the finest lessons? I have one for you today, and it comes right out of the Old Testament, and it involves one of the Lord's leading characters. Here are some of the saddest, heart-rending, wrenched-out words ever spoken. David said them after a report that was brought to him that his son had been murdered in the forest of Ephraim. Listen to the words, 2 Samuel 18:33. Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. David, king of Israel, he was no stranger to death. And he was no stranger to tears, or was he a stranger to murder? And he was no stranger to disappointment. And he was also no stranger to sin. But if you combined all these tragedies, nothing compares to the death of his son Absalom. Why would this happen to David? He didn't deserve that. He wrote the lion's share of most of the Psalms that you have in the Psalter. He told of so many blessings. They were full of exuberant joy. Why, his words even overflowed with God's generosity. He used to say, "My cup runneth over." Then comes this full measure of rejection, even alienation, rebellion, and now despair. Now he finds himself in the middle of a betrayal and ruin. Did you know that Jesus found himself in that same position 1,000 years later? Here's what he said: "Remove, God, this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Luke 22:42. The cup was not removed either from Jesus nor from David. Both drank their cup right down to the last drop. And they both emptied the cup. And they both tested the bitterness, and they felt the reality of some very deep suffering. Well, this became David's darkest moment. Love and hate came as that deep experience. Good and evil, they came together head to head. Now come these words, once again. "Oh, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And his tears flowed down his cheek. Those of you, you've suffered. Have you felt like that? Do you identify with David and Jesus? None of us are exempt. You know that. Christians get cancer in the same proportion as non-Christians. And we're involved in as many automobile accidents as non-believers. And when you slip and do a faceplant on the sidewalk, it hurts just as much after you become a Christian as it did before. Being a Christian doesn't give you an edge over the competition. Have you heard the well-paid religious leaders giving you tips on their success and how if you would follow them, you'll have it too? If you'd only sign up, give me a little more money. They're going to send you a book. They might send you a little lecture, and they'll certainly give you a sermon or two, selling you on the fast track to the supernatural. As I read Matthew, as I read Mark, as I read Luke, and I read John, none of them give me any marketing technique for improving my living standard. I don't look to David to find a trouble-free life. Let's focus on David's suffering in relation to his son Absalom. Because we live in a world of sin, suffering can be ours, and sometimes it can be suffering for others. Let me tell you about Absalom, David's son. He was the son that most of us wouldn't want to have. Absalom had a beautiful sister. Her name was Tamar. He raped her 11 years ago. Absalom had a brother. His name was Amnon. He also had an infatuation with Tamar as well as Absalom. After a time, he planned and he raped Tamar too. When Absalom learned of the rape, well, he was outraged. And he wanted revenge to honor his sister. So what did he do? He lost his temper. And he brutally murdered Amnon. 2 Samuel 13:1. Absalom was his father, David's favorite son. To hide murder, he fled the country. He crossed the Jordan. He went into exile in the land of Geshur. That was the country of his wife's family, 2 Samuel 13:37. After 3 years in exile, he changed his mind and he decided, I'm going to come home. And now this story takes a strange turn. David had learned about the murder of Amnon. So he refused to see Absalom when he came back. And he let Absalom return to his own city. But he was never allowed in his presence. David held on to his bitterness over Amnon's murder. Well, Absalom experienced total rejection from his dad. Sin does funny things, doesn't it? The rape of Tamar led to the murder of Amnon. That led to David's hard-hearted rejection. Absalom, he responded to Amnon's sin by sinning again. David responded to Absalom's sin by sinning again. Absalom got rid of Amnon by killing him. David, he got rid of Absalom by shunning him. David lost his Amnon son because of sin of Absalom. David lost his son Absalom because of his own sin. Wouldn't it have been nice if David could have lived 1,000 years later and heard Jesus' story of the prodigal son? Jesus told about a father whose son went into a far country, lived a life of complete self-indulgence, returned home, but he was broke, having spent his father's inheritance. And he disgraced his father's house. He made his dad's reputation stink in that land where he was. What did the father do? He never quit looking for him. He kept looking for a way to forgive him and restore him back into the family. Finally, when he did come home, that father, what did he do? He greeted him. He embraced him. He welcomed him home with a great big banquet. Luke 15, verse 11. Can't you picture David being that father? What if Absalom, before he fled off across the Jordan, he had sat down with his dad, and his dad said to him, tell me, Absalom, did you have an affection for your sister Tamar? That's not unusual for a beautiful girl to be attracted by men. In your anger to Amnon, did you take his life? And then in your silence, you wanted to run away in exile? What if that happened, that once more, David forgave him and he had his son back again, just like the prodigal father? The son would be once again with the dad, and David would have had a boy, his own son, back. David didn't do that. He turned on his son Absalom. Do you want to know his problem? He refused to forgive him. He held a grudge. He refused and withheld grace. He denied that boy of his mercy. As you recall, David made a lot of blunders in his life. The adultery with Bathsheba in his affair of passionate moment. The murder of Uriah to avoid detection. This last one is the most inexcusable of all. The rejection of Absalom. Day by day, David's heart grew colder and colder towards his son. If you were Absalom, treated like that, what would you do? Remember, Jerusalem wasn't a very big city when he came home. It's pretty difficult to avoid being seen in that great big city. But David didn't see his son Absalom. For the next 4 years, Absalom is going to make his dad pay for that rejection. And he takes things into his own hands. He's going to get even. His father excluded him. He's now going to exclude his father. And he's going to get rid of his father, not only from the present, but from his kingdom. He's going to plan revenge. And it's going to get so deep, at the right moment, he's going to take it. 2 Samuel 15:1. He starts sowing seeds of dissension against his dad. He gets the people on his side. And then he revolts. And he confidently proclaims himself as king. And he kicks his dad out of the royal palace. Absalom takes over. David flees for his life. Where does he go? He goes back to the wilderness. That's where he spent most of his years as a young man. Earlier, all by himself. 2 Samuel 15:13. And it was back in that wilderness that David formed his character. The character of David was made in the wilderness. And now we find him recovering from the greatest blow in his life. He's now unemployed as a king, once again on the run. Sometimes hardship brings the best out of us. Have you ever found that? Sometimes suffering can make us better instead of worse. As David became less and less a father, he also became less and less a king. I also think that his prayer life suffered. I think he slipped from asking God for help and direction. Have you ever felt that way? David was tossed from the throne to the wilderness. That could have destroyed me. It could have destroyed him. He could have become defiant. It could have made him bitter. And he certainly would have been lonely. He didn't. This lesson is a story of David's recovery. It actually forms a pattern. David is going to do 3 things that's going to help him restore again the throne that he just lost back in Jerusalem. If you're David and you're listening to me, these things might even apply to you. It's a recovery kit, I call it. Here are the 3 things in the kit. 1, he once again learned humility. 2, in the kit, he also learned how to pray again. 3, in that kit, the last thing he learned was compassion. Let me look at them with you. First, humility. When David was leaving Jerusalem, fleeing Absalom because of that coup, a man named Shimei, he was stalking him along the ridge above the road that David was taking. And then he began throwing rocks at David and yelling curses. The Bible doesn't tell us what he said, but I'll make it up. You worthless old man. You dirty murderer, corrupt, phony king. One of David's captains, who was with him traveling, said to David, "Let me go over and take that man's head off. Nobody's going to talk to my king that way." David held him back. He said, That man Shimei is right. He's telling the truth. God is speaking through him. It's God's voice, not his, that I'm hearing. God commanded him to curse me. Leave him alone. My suffering is going to bring me once again into the presence of my Lord. He faced the truth. He wasn't king anymore. He was just simply a sinner. God's mercy and grace came from the lips of Shimei. That's what I call humility. David got back in touch with himself again, and he also got back in touch with the God that he worshiped. Humility. That's the first lesson you learn in the kit for your recovery. Here's the second one. Prayer. David, in the royal court, he had a trusted advisor. He was a man named Ahithophel. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Ahithophel. Anyway, he had a reputation of being a very wise man and very reliable. David could trust him. And David counted on him for that respect. And he led through David's leadership for many years. And the truth was never distorted. It says in 2 Samuel 16:23, in those days, the counsel of Ahithophel was as if you had consulted the oracle of God. But after all these years of friendship, watch what he does. He's going to betray David. He took Absalom's side against him. He became a turncoat. He became an opportunist. And the man inside was really hollow. He saw a new political future if he could follow this new king, Absalom. With Absalom's rebellion, he pounced on the position. And Absalom supported him. If you read Psalm 55, David's psalm, he describes Ahithophel and his activity. Get down to verse 20 and verse 21. Here's what it says. My best friend betrayed his best friend. His life betrayed his words. All my life, I've been charmed by his speech, never dreaming that he would turn on me. His words that were music to my ears have become daggers to my heart. How do you like that? Then David's prayer. 2 Samuel 15:21. O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Sometimes suffering can be a stimulus for our recovery to your prayer life. David has learned two things in his recovery. He's learned humility, and now he's learned prayer. Here's the third one. Compassion. David is going to finally get in touch with his son, Absalom. Civil war broke out between David's old troops and Absalom's new army. David joined his old army to do battle, and he deployed them into 3 different sections. He planned to go to the front line himself to encourage and build the morale of his commands. But his military officers, they wouldn't hear of it. They said, 2 Samuel 18:3, you're worth 10,000 of us, so you stay back behind where it's safe. But as David accepted their counsel, he did stay back. But he also said this, don't kill my son Absalom. Deal gently for my sake with that young man. 2 Samuel 18:5. Those words are strange. Only days before, David received word that Absalom for years has been undermining his rule, and he's been plotting to kill his dad and take over the kingdom. David just found that out a few days before this. David was king, hunted down by his son, his own son. And now he turned the whole country against him. Here's David ordering his men, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Do you know what that tells me? David had recovered his sense, his old self, the old David that we used to know. It all came back. After preaching of Shimei, and then through the life of prayer, he handled the treachery of Ahithophel. Now his compassion turns for his love for his son. Absalom is recovered. The worst rejection spawned the most wonderful love. David had a general in his army. He didn't share David's love for Absalom. His name was Joab. Absalom, he was riding his horse back in the battle scene. And guess what? He got his hair caught in the tree branches, and the horse rode off underneath and left him dangling there as the horse sped away. Joab, David's commander, he spotted him hanging by his hair from those limbs. He got out a spear, and with his spear, he stabbed Absalom. 10 armor bearers standing by, seeing this, they moved in and they finished Absalom off. 2 Samuel 18:9. Loving Absalom that day was one of David's greatest hours. And when the report of Absalom's death came back, what does David do? He falls apart. He just weeps, and the tears just flow down his cheek. David had moved from years of hard-hearted rejection to heartbreaking tears of lament. Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, my son. Would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. Have you noticed the parallel of the gospel story of Jesus? The sorrow of a father whose son had been forgiven. Suffering doesn't make us less. It does make us more human, more loving. Father, forgive them, said Jesus on the cross. They don't know what they're doing. Years ago, right across from my church, there was a large department store. In that store was a pharmacist. That pharmacist was a member of my church. From time to time, I would cross the street, walk into the store just for some exercise to get away from my office desk. And I'd stop and I'd say hi to my druggist. One day when I was over there, sitting inside the main door was the security officer. That's what they did in those days. They'd sit in a chair just inside the main door, and you'd say hi to them as you went by, and they'd keep an eye on you. I didn't know who he was. But when I walked by, I don't know what possessed me, but I nodded at him and I said to him, keep an eye on me. I'm a shoplifter. As I walked through the store, I could tell out of the corner of my eye, that officer, he was following me. Every aisle that I went down, I would look back as a glance, and there I'd see his face sticking around the corner. Well, you know, I felt absolutely ashamed of myself because of what I told him. So I said, I better beat it. I went over to the counter of the drugstore and I said hi to Skip, my druggist. And then I went back to my office. Many weeks later, my secretary knocked on my door and said, Ron, do you have time to speak to a couple? I don't know them. They haven't made an appointment, but they come in and they want to ask you if you could do a favor for them. Do you think you could speak to them? Sure, bring them in, I said. I stood up and I greeted them, sat them down. We talked. They were both older. They wanted me to conduct their marriage. They had been together now dating for some time, and they wanted to do a wedding ceremony. They wondered if I would do it. And would I do it over at his house? He didn't live far from the church. It was a second marriage for both. They'd been single again for some time, lived alone in their own home. At his house, he wanted to have the wedding. I did. They were a lovely couple. I did the wedding at his house. The guests were small in number, just a few of the members of their own family on each side. The new bride and groom, they started attending my church. His name was Frank. One day I said to him, Frank, how was it that you picked me to do your wedding? He said, you know the pharmacist at our store, Skip? He and I were good friends. I told him I wanted to get married, and he recommended me. He was your pastor, and he said that he would do it. And then he said to me, do you remember the day when you came into the store and you told a security officer that you were a shoplifter? I stared at that man. Remember how I started this lesson? Sometimes strangest events can teach us the finest lessons. That man was the security officer that I thought was chasing me, and he turned out to be one of my best friends. You've heard the story of Absalom, and you've heard the story of his father. Are any of you out there like that? Do you have a son that you're not speaking to? Do you have family activities going on inside your house and you can't solve them? Remember what I said. There happens to be a kit that can help you bring it all back together. Amen.